Good afternoon and welcome to our class on medical terminology, Unit 1. And our topic for Unit 1 is on Introduction to Medical Language and Healthcare today. Just a quick reminder of the information that I'm the instructor for this module, and for accessibility, if you want to reach out to me, that's my office address, email, the phone number, my consulting hours are there for your use. At the end of this week, it is expected that we should be able to identify the skills of medical language communication. It's also significant that as office assistants, we're able to identify the characteristics of word parts, be able to build, spell, pronounce, and divide common medical words, describe and identify the various anatomical positions, and if possible, it's also significant that we are able to understand what health is and describe the various categories of diseases. When we're looking at medical language, basically we know medical language is very significant in medical terminology, and from these different words that we can see on the word cloud here, we'll see that these are various words that are used to describe health conditions or body systems or procedures in the medical field. So, looking at the word medical language, I would say it's very key and significant in understanding the healing that takes place in the world of medicine. And more importantly, is that as medical office assistants, when we understand this medical language, it helps us to be able to document, to diagnose, and also to be able to treat our patients. And this will enhance our ability to be able to communicate accurately and effectively while ensuring the safety of our patients. And also, as medical office assistants, I think it's important for us to know that understanding of medical language can help us collaborate more better with other health care professionals, and we can all work together to improve the overall quality of medical settings. So that is this about medical language. And when we're looking at language, basically language is a very important aspect of communication. If we cannot communicate effectively, then it becomes a problem. So when we're looking at medical communication, we look at it more like the process of how we as medical office assistants, how we are able to share information or create health related information. And when we're looking at this, how do we share information, how do we create health related information? We do this by reading, we do this by writing, we do this by spelling, we do this by speaking, we do this by analyzing them. So the five important skills of medical communication is just what I've mentioned, which is the reading, the listening, the writing and spelling, the speaking, pronouncing, thinking, and understanding. So when we're looking at reading, it's very, very important for us, especially as medical office assistants, that we are able to read in between. We work with other health professionals that speaks the common terminologies used. They understand this. So we as office assistants, we should be able to also read and interpret these prescriptions, these charts, these documents that are used. Listening is another very key aspect. It's very, very essential. How are we as individuals or as medical office assistants, how are we able to understand the keywords that are used in medical communication? We'll be able to speak them in conversations. When we're speaking to doctors, speaking to nurses, they will more or less conversate in these terminologies. So it's very, very important that even we as office assistants, we are also able to conversate in these terminologies. And writing is very, very important. Writing and spelling, writing the correct spelling, so that we don't make errors when we are writing prescription or when we are interpreting whatever the doctors have said. is very, very important. Our ability to give the proper punctuation, to give a grammatical construction of what we are writing. We need to be able to identify the key words that are used in all these things. Is very, very important for us, how to be concise, how to be open, how to literally explain in our writing, because we are documenting whatever the doctors have said. So it's very important. We play a very major role here, because if we make a mistake, it can cause an havoc, it can cause error, it can even lead to the death of a patient when you write a wrong prescription just because of a simple mistake, you know. So it's very important. These skills are very, very significant. And we'll talk of speaking and pronouncing is also significant, because sometimes what we pronounce is what we write. What we pronounce is what patients hear, and that is what they go with to the pharmacy and all that. So speaking is also very significant, because we need to be able to clearly articulate the stems when we're talking with patients, talking with other health professionals and all that. And the last one there, which I think is the most significant, is how do we decode? How do we interpret? How do we code? How do we modify? This has to do with our ability to analyze, to think, and to understand the keywords that are being used. So it's very, very important that we understand that the 5 key skills of communication when it comes to medical language is our ability to read, listen, write and speak, write and spell, speak and pronounce, think, analyze and understand. Then this takes us to the next slide, where we'll look at the origin of medical language. Now, looking at the origin of medical language, one thing is that the study of words, medical languages, they are more like words. And when we're studying words from origin, we use this concept is interpreted as etymology. But it's very significant for us to understand that most of the medical language or medical words that we use, they originally they originally came from the Greek word and the Latin word. And you see, these words that came right from years before centuries. These are words that in the beginning of the first century, they were used in medicine in the Roman world, and they have become very significant in the development of even modern medicine that we use today. So we will sometimes refer to these words as classical words. These are classical words in the Greek era, which, before the death of Jesus, before Christ was born. A typical example, back then we have some Greek words where they use in describing diseases and symptoms, like kata, which is a downflow. We have diarrhea, which is a true flow. We have dyspnea, which is a bad breathing. We have a melancholic, which has to do with pertaining to black bile. We also have words like podgra. These are Greek words. They are more like root words, which has to do with foot trap. So when we're looking at medical words, we have quite a number of them that they did not really, some of them did not really change from the original words which they were known for. However, some of them has also been modified. We could look at a typical example from what we have here. We have some medical words that did not change from their origin of words, either from the Latin or from the Greek. We have the nucleus, which still remains the same as the Latin nucleus. We have the paranoi, which still remains as the Greek word of paranoi. However, we have some Latin words as well that have been replaced by Greek words ending them. We have like stomachus and we have brachium. These are words that they've been replaced from their original meaning. And we have like words like, for instance, in the Greek word we have pyloros, and now it is called pyloros, like R-U-S, Ros. In the Greek word is pyloros, R-O-S, P-Y-L-O-R-O-S. In the Greek words, we have words like Elios, E-I-L-E-O-S. But now in recent time, it's now been modified into Ilios, I-L-E-U-S. So we'll see most of these words are words we speak, medical words are still from the origin words but with little modification. However, I think it's also important to know that when we're talking of medical words, we also have expression of these words from singular to plural words. How do we form words in medical field? So looking at this, a typical example of this, we have some words that are ending with a, which can change to aa. Take for instance, we have the word vertebra. If you look at the word vertebra, changing it to this way can change it to plural with the word vertebrae with ae. You use it with the word ae. Sometimes we also have some medical words where we can add, we can remove the us and change to I. Take for instance, we drop the us, we add I. We have bronchus, which is to broke I. We have words ending in is, which we can drop the is for singular and we change it to plural by adding the word es. We have diagnosis, diagnosis. We have words that are ending in which we can drop the and add the a to change them from singular to plural. We have the bacterium to bacteria. We have words ending with x, and they can be changed into ngs as a plural form. We have the word phalanx, which becomes phalanges. In some cases, we have some words that also end in o, and we can add s to them, especially words that are preceded by vowels. We have like ratio, which can become ratios. These are like common rules. These are like common rules. We have like, if you have endoscope, we have endoscopes. If a word is ending with a vowel sound, you can always add an s. These are common rules that precedes how plural forms are created in medical world. Although there are some exceptions where we have some medical words that are derived from Latin or Greek, and the rule of English pluralization might not necessarily apply to them, and we also have some words that when pluralized, they use the kind of irregular words. For instance, we can't use the word woman for womans. So we have women, we have women. So these are just some of the few basic rules, I will say basic rules, that are used in creating the plural terms in medical words. And we need to familiarize ourselves with these basic rules. Another thing I'll be looking at is looking at the characteristics of word parts. So when we're looking at word parts in medical terminology, word parts basically will say medical terms are made up of word characters, and these word characters, they are either the original word, which we call the root word, or they are made as a result of certain words that are added in the beginning, which are called prefix, or we call them certain words added towards the end of the word, which are called the suffixes. So we'll look at the word roots. Here when we're looking at the word root, we can look at the word root as the foundational. We call it the foundation, the basic word parts that gives essential meaning to medical terms. They are the basic. They don't change. Those are the basic word parts in medical field, and they basically don't change. They give meaning to this. They are written in a particular form where we have the root word, a forward slash, the combining vowel, and the hyphen. Then we have the prefix. Just like the word, the prefix comes at the beginning of a word, and this prefix, they provide like additional information to the specific word in question. And this information could come in, it could be in numbers, it could be in location, it could be in size, it could be in quantity, depending on the expression. A typical example we could see for now is the hyper in hypertension, which means excessive. In the next slide, we'll be looking at more examples of this word parts. And the last one there is the suffix. Suffix, as we said, comes towards the end and it basically modifies the meaning of a word. And example is the itis in the word gastritis. Gastritis meaning inflammation. So typical examples of the various word parts here, as we can see, we have here the neuro meaning nerve, the hemato meaning blood. We have the dorsal or the dorsal, which means back or posterior. We have the cardio, the heart, dermato meaning skin. Prefixes, we have an, which means not or without. We have anti, which means against. We have re, which means again and again, or backward or unable to. We have the brady, which means slow, and we have the peri, which means around. We have more different word parts. You when you go to the elements, you'll see the documents, but this is just to give an overview of what those word parts are all about. And we have the suffixes, which is we have my AC is pertaining to, we have AC, we have AR, we have IC, all this means pertaining to. We have ION, which means an action or condition. We have ectomy, which means surgical and removal of something. We have the megaly, which means enlargement, and we have logi, which means study of. There are more, just like I've said, there are quite a number of words, suffixes, prefixes, root words, and their meanings that we need to familiarize ourselves with. This is just a few of them. You could check from the material posted on the platform and have access to those informations. Then the next one we'll be looking at is the body plane. Now, when we're looking at body planes in medical terminology, body planes basically, this we can say the body planes are basically very essential in terms of, they are understanding anatomical terminologies. How do we explain the body parts to patients? How do we help our patients to understand the various parts of the body? So see, sometimes we hear some words that are very important. Where we've talked about the prefix, we've talked about the suffix, but here we'll look at how do we explain the direction of our body, anatomical position. How do we make reference? When a person is standing upright, when something is caught in between, when something is divided, or when we look at imaginary planes that divides a body or slices a body. Now, in body planes, we look at these imaginary lines that divides a body. The first one we'll look at is the frontal plane, which is called the frontal imaginary plane. When we look at this frontal plane, the frontal plane basically, this has to do with the vertical plane that divides the body into the front and the backward section. That is the frontal plane. It divides the body into the front and the backward section. And we could also look at this frontal plane, which is also known as the coronal plane. And the front section, we call it the anterior, while the back section, we call it the posterior. Then we'll look at the next one, which is the transverse plane. If you look at the transverse plane, which we can sometimes call the axial plane, the transverse plane is more on the horizontal. If you look at this diagram, we'll see that the transverse plane is more on the horizontal, and it's formed at a right angle. You see that it's formed at a right angle to the sagittal plane. This is the transverse plane. Is formed at a right angle to the sagittal plane, and is also at a right angle to the frontal plane. Now, this transverse plane basically has to do with dividing, or say slicing the body into the upper and the lower section. The upper section we refer to as the superior section, and the lower section we refer to as the inferior section. So it is obtained when something cuts across. That is what we call a transverse view or a axial view. And we'll look at the third one, which is the sagittal. We'll look at the sagittal plane. Now we'll look at this sagittal plane. This is basically an imaginary vertical plane we can see from here, This is a vertical plane that divides the body into the left and the right parts. It slices the body longitudinally into the left and the right parts. And for instance, let's if this is an apple, when we cut an apple into two, into left and right, the same thing applies there. However, when we look at the sagittal plane, there is something we call the mid sagittal. The mid sagittal, mid as this word means something is into equal halves, is into equal right and left. That is the mid sagittal. In some cases, we also see people say parasagittal. It's left and right, but probably the left is probably more wider or more bigger than the right or something like that. That is the body plane. Now, if we go into the directions, there are different directions of the body. As we can see from this diagram, we have cranial, which is we call caudal. We have the posterior or dorsal. We have the anterior or ventral. We have the caudal. Now, let's look at it starting from the anterior. When we look at the anterior means something in front. So it looks at the direction of the body towards the front. We're looking at something in direction of the front of the body. For instance, the toe is in front of the body. We have the toe is in front of the body. So we look at anterior as something in front of the body. When we look at posterior, we look at something behind or at the back. If you want to describe a disease or something at the back of the body, we will say it's posterior to the body part. And when we're looking at anterior, another word for anterior, as we can see from there, is ventral. Is towards the front of the body. And when it is posterior, we say it is dorsal, which is towards the back of the body. Then another one we'll be looking at there is the cephalad. Now, when we look at the cephalad, basically, which is also known as the cranial, we look at it as something towards the head, above. It is above the body. It's at the upper part of the body. It's towards the head of the body. It's above the body. And when we look at the word caudal, the caudal means inferior. It means it's towards the tailbone or below the body part. Caudal means towards the tailbone, towards the feet, is below the body part. That is what the caudal means. When something is below the body part. Cranial, superior, I said, is something superior. When something is above, is higher than other part of the body, is towards the head of the body. Still looking at the directions, we also look at what we call proximal. Now, looking at this word proximal, we can see that when we say something is proximal, we look at it in terms of when it is closer to the trunk or the center of a body. Let's take, for instance, if the center of the point of origin is probably towards the shoulder, we can say something is moving. If it's moving close to it, we say is moving proximal to a body system. But if it is moving away from the origin of the body, we say it is moving at a distal. Distal means it's moving away from the point of origin. It's moving away from the trunk. It's moving away from the joints. It's moving away from the attachment, the point of attachment. It's moving away from it. That is distal. And we'll look at medial. Medial, this basically has to do with the median, the middle. We can see from the diagram when something is towards the middle of the body, we say, or if it's moving towards the middle of the body, we say is medial to the body system. And we look at the way the word lateral. The word lateral basically has to do with when something is moving away from the body. So the word lateral means it's describing the direction towards the side of the body. Is moving towards, is going towards the side, is moving away from the media, is moving away from the middle part of the body, but it's going towards the side of the body. Then we have the word superficial. When we look at superficial, we look at structures of the body that are apparent, that are on the surface. These are structures of the body that are visible, that we can see. They are nearer to the surface. And we have structures of the body that are also far away from the surface. They are deep within. They are inside the body. This is when we say it is deep. Typical example when we say the brain is deep into the skull. Then the next part that we'll be looking at, remember I said we are just trying to look at the various terminologies that will be used along the line in this course, because we'll be looking more deeply into this when we get to the second outline. Then the next one we'll be looking at here is the body cavities. Now, when we look at the body cavity itself, we say a cavity is a hollow space or a fluid surrounded by bones or muscles that support and protect the organs and structures. And looking at this body cavity, they are basically divided into two. We have the ventral cavity and we have the dorsal cavity. In terms of the ventral cavity, ventral, we know something that is forward and dorsal is at the back. The ventral cavity is further divided into two, which is the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. When we look at the cranial cavity, from the word ventral, the cranial cavity basically contains the brain, the cranial nerves, and the related structure. And when we look at this cranial cavity, we'll see that it's within the body cranium of the head. The cranial cavity plays a significant role in the body system. Looking at the cranial cavities again, I think one thing I will also make us to understand is that the cranial cavity, it's very, very important because they help us in understanding how this body are being carried out. The next one there we'll look at the spinal cavity, which is another example of the dorsal cavity. When we look at the spinal cavity, you see the spinal cavity is very long. It's a narrow cavity that is inside the vertebral column, and it runs like the length of a trunk and contains the spinal cord. So you see it contains the spinal cord, the spinal nerve, and its related structure. So if you look at the cranial cavity, which has the brain, and the spinal cavity, which has the spinal cord, these two are protected by the bones of the skull and the vertebrae of the spine, and they are further protected by the meninges. We'll look more into that as we go on. Then we have the second type of cavity, which I said is the ventral cavity. When we look at the ventral cavity is the anterior, is in front of the trunk, and it contains organs like the lungs, the heart, the stomach, the intestine, the reproductive organs. The ventral cavity basically has the thoracic cavity in it and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Basically, one important function of the ventral cavity is that it allows considerable changes of size and shape within the organs where they perform their functions. A typical example, we could look at the lungs, the stomach, the uterus. These organs, they can expand and contract without distorting any issues or disrupting any activities of nearby organs. Another part of the ventral cavity is the abdominal pelvic cavity. And this abdominal pelvic cavity is a combination of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity itself. And as we can see here, that it's the abdominal cavity has the large intestine, spleen, liver, the kidney, and the pelvic cavity has some of the male genitalia, the large intestine as well, the bladder, the uterus. And I would say basically the functions of the abdominal pelvic cavity is they help to fill the lower half of the trunk, and they hold the digestive organs. That's particularly the abdominal cavity. It helps to hold the digestive organs and the kidney, while the pelvic cavity helps to host the reproductive organs and organs of excretion. I think these are the basic informations that we need to know as an introductory into this unit for this week.